Welcome back to our studios here in Lahore. I'm Hamza Amjad. Now, Pakistan says the world has rejected India's narrative of painting occupied Kashmir's indigenous freedom movement as terrorism. Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi said Pakistan's relentless efforts have got the world discussing the Kashmir conflict. Addressing the Kashmir conference in Islamabad, he said Pakistan will always stand with the Kashmiris. He said global bodies, including the EU and UN, have supported Pakistan's stance on the current Kashmir crisis. He says even India's own Supreme Court has exposed Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government's illegal annexation. Addressing the conference, Azad Kashmir Prime Minister Raja Farooq Haider said Pakistan is a stumbling block for India. President Arif Alvi and Senate Chairman Sadiq Sanjarani will also address the conference. Meanwhile, the European Parliament has called the situation in Indian-occupied Kashmir alarming and unacceptable. Meeting in Strasbourg, the Parliament strongly criticised India for denying Kashmiris their right to self-determination under UN resolutions. Now, the EU Parliament was discussing the deepening crisis in occupied Kashmir after India's illegal annexation of the disputed territory. European lawmakers asked India to end its lockdown of occupied Kashmir and lift its communications blackouts. It said New Delhi must be held accountable for the murder of Kashmiris by the Indian Army. European Commission Vice President Federica Mogherini said the situation in the valley is unacceptable. MEP Klaus Buchner said the UN must intervene and send a peace mission to evaluate the situation. EU Minister Titi Tuparainen said the Union will continue to closely monitor the situation in Indian-occupied Kashmir. The Indian government says it will keep detained politicians from occupied Kashmir behind bars for up to 18 months. The Minister of State for the Prime Minister's office, Jitendra Singh, is the first senior functionary to put a timeline on their detentions. Leaders of the Kashmir freedom struggle and other local politicians were arrested after the annexation of Kashmir's special status on August the 5th. Meanwhile, the senior Turkish MP Hakan Çavuşoğlu has called on India to immediately halt its human rights violations in the valley. The head of the Turkish Parliament's Human Rights Commission says Kashmir has become one of the most sensitive regions in the world. Now, the Taliban say its doors are still open for peace talks if US President Donald Trump wants to resume dialogue. In an interview, Taliban chief negotiator Sher Mohammad Abbas Stanikzei said negotiations are the only path to peace in Afghanistan. Stanikzei said the Taliban did nothing wrong by launching attacks on US troops in the absence of any ceasefire. He said the US should not have reacted to the death of one American soldier by killing thousands of Taliban fighters, as Washington has claimed. The chief negotiator said the Taliban hope that the US will rethink its decision and resume negotiations. The Taliban have claimed responsibility for 2 suicide bombings that killed 48 people in Afghanistan yesterday. The UN Security Council has unanimously agreed to extend its political mission in Afghanistan. Established in 2002, the UN mission is helping Afghanistan prepare for elections being held on the 28th of September. It is also pushing for peace talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban. Talks between the US and Taliban to end the decades-long Afghan war collapsed earlier this month. Now to Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's right-wing coalition has failed to secure a majority after Tuesday's elections. The exit polls point to Netanyahu trailing behind his rival Benny Gantz. Exit polls suggest Netanyahu and his right-wing bloc have failed to reach the required 61 seats for a majority. The polls put Netanyahu's Likud party at 31 seats, trailing behind Gantz's Blue and White party by 2. Israel's election commission says the final turnout was nearly 70%. The former military chief Gantz had ruled out taking part in an administration with Netanyahu. Gantz was quick to claim victory, although many believe that the results were too close to call. Saudi Arabia says the attacks on its oil facilities are a real test of the global will to confront threats to stability. Speaking to South Korea's President Moon Jae-in by phone, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman stressed the need for a global response. He asked Seoul's help in beefing up the kingdom's air defenses. The two leaders agreed to continue consultations. President Moon also emphasized the importance of a unified international response. He said the attack represents a threat to world security. Now, Britain and Germany have agreed to collectively respond to last weekend's airstrikes on oil installations in Saudi Arabia. In a phone call, Prime Minister Boris Johnson and Chancellor Angela Merkel stressed the need to work with international partners to resolve the crisis. PM Johnson also called Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. He reiterated the UK support for Saudi Arabia and offered to help with its security. Moving on, international oil prices have declined over 6% since Saudi Arabia said it would restore its full supply capacity by the end of this month. More in this report.
Much of Saudi Arabia's oil supply capacity has been offline since two major oil installations were damaged in airstrikes on Saturday. Saudi Energy Minister Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman says the kingdom has plugged the shortfall in supplies by tapping inventories.
Over the last 2 days, the damage has been contained, and more than half of the production capabilities that were damaged as a result of the attack have been recovered. The company will meet its commitments to its customers for this month by withdrawing from its reserves of crude oil and making some changes to some oils with the view that complete production capabilities are restored to 11 million barrels per day by the end of September.
The Saudi Energy Minister says the kingdom will continue to play its role as a secure supplier to the global oil markets.
Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif has said the US and its allies have been committing war crimes in Yemen for almost half a decade. Zarif said Washington is embarrassed its hundreds of billions worth arms could not intercept Yemeni fire. In a series of tweets, he said the US double standards have been exposed as it didn't care while bombing famished civilians in Yemen. He said Washington is in denial if it thinks that Yemeni victims of the worst war crimes wouldn't strike back. The foreign minister said blaming Iran would not change anything because ending the war is the only solution. Yemen's Houthi rebels targeted 2 Saudi oil refineries on Saturday, cutting the kingdom's oil production in half. Washington blamed Iran for the strikes, which Tehran rejects strongly. Venezuela's government and 5 opposition party leaders have agreed to start a new dialogue process. Main opposition leader Juan Guaido was not part of the new deal. President Nicolas Maduro said the agreement has opened all doors to dialogue and political stability. Hours later, the government released Guaido's number 2, Edgar Zambrano, in what appeared to be a goodwill gesture. Meanwhile, the US and its allies have invoked the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance. US Department of State spokesperson Morgan Ortagus said the action was taken to confront the threat posed by Maduro. Now let's talk about the Tunisian presidential polls. 2 anti-establishment candidates have taken the highest vote share in the first round. The Electoral Commission says law professor Kais Said leads the first round of voting, while jailed media mogul Nabil Karoui is second. Both have advanced to the runoff round, which will be held in November. 26 candidates, including the current Prime Minister and a former president, are running for the top office. The Election Commission says voter turnout remains 45%, down from 64% in 2014. Tunisia is the only democracy to emerge from the 2011 Arab Spring. Today, the UK Supreme Court will resume its hearing of petitions challenging the legality of the government's decision to suspend Parliament. Yesterday, 11 judges began their hearing of 2 separate petitions which argue Prime Minister Boris Johnson misguided the Queen. The first hearing was held with demonstrations outside the Supreme Court in London. Lawyers for the petitioners told the court that MPs were being silenced ahead of a no-deal Brexit. However, government lawyer Richard Keane said Prime Minister Boris Johnson did not overreach or breach his authority. He said Johnson would take remedial action if the court rules against the suspension of the House of Commons. Keane told the court Johnson can ask the Queen to recall Parliament, but he did not rule out the possibility that Johnson might consider suspending the Parliament again.
I have given a clear undertaking that the Prime Minister will respond by all necessary means to any declaration that the original prorogation was affected by any unlawful advice that he might have given.
And opposition lawyer Lord Panic tried to convince the Supreme Court judges otherwise.
Indeed, it's a greater breach, or could be a greater breach, of parliamentary sovereignty to prevent Parliament from legislating as it sees fit than it is for the executive to defy a particular law.
Now, the UK says striking a trade deal with Australia will be a priority after Brexit. On her visit to Canberra, Britain's Trade Minister Liz Truss said she expects a quick conclusion to trade talks. Truss is in the middle of a three-nation tour that includes Australia, New Zealand and Japan. It is aimed at preparing for trade negotiations after Brexit. Truss said the UK is ready to start working out the details of negotiations with New Zealand. She said signing an independent trade deal after leaving the bloc is vital for the UK.
The UK trades more with the rest of the world than the EU, and that is where a lot of the growing markets are. So there is a big opportunity for us to do things differently and to use those new freedoms we have.
Spain will be heading to the polls for the fourth time in as many years on November the 10th. Acting Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez announced fresh elections after failing to form a coalition government. In polls held in April, Sanchez's Socialist Party won the most seats but fell short of a parliamentary majority. He called fresh elections after King Felipe failed to build a consensus between rival party leaders. At a press conference, Sanchez blamed the opposition for the political deadlock. But the right-wing People's Party and Ciudadanos Party says Sanchez is responsible. And coming up next in the Bulletin. "5G sparked a nationwide revolt in Switzerland." And a boy without legs is using skateboards to move around. Welcome back. Now, Switzerland was among the first countries to begin deploying the new 5G telecommunication system. But now worries around the harmful effects of radiation from antennas have sparked a nationwide revolt. Demonstrators against the technology will be filling the streets of the capital, Bern, later this month.
A growing number of Swiss people are voicing alarm at the possible health risks from exposure to electromagnetic radiation from the new 5G antennae. They have threatened to put the issue to a referendum in a country famous for its system of direct democracy. This allowed the country to pull in revenues of nearly 380 million Swiss francs.
The cantons have risen, 4 or 5 cantons have voted on a moratoria they removed a few days later by the Confederation, which has sold the licenses and has said it is not your area of expertise. You cannot decide, and it's ultimately the whole Swiss political system that is challenged.
Several cantons, including Geneva, have buckled to pressure from online petitioners demanding a halt to the construction of the 5G infrastructure. Opponents are urging authorities to put a moratorium on the rollout. The Swiss Federation of Doctors is also urging caution, especially if there is no proof of any risk to health caused by the increased radiation.
Somehow we are for technology, but technology that works in harmony with life. We cannot stop the progress of technology, we cannot stop the evolution, but it is sure now that 5G is a big no. It does not work that way. When we dig a little deeper, it does not work.
A group of experts was appointed by the Swiss government last year to probe the risks involved with introducing 5G. Their findings will be published later this year.
Now, New York has become the second US state to ban flavored e-cigarettes following Michigan. This follows a mysterious surge of severe respiratory illnesses and 7 deaths linked to vaping. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo proposed the emergency ban, citing a surging use among young people. The state's Public Health and Planning Council voted to adopt the prohibition. In a statement, Cuomo's office said the ban applies to all flavored e-cigarettes besides menthol. Meanwhile, the state of California has ordered a vaping public awareness campaign. Governor Gavin Newsom unveiled a $20 million budget to educate young people about its health dangers. Climate activists from Extinction Rebellion held a funeral procession for London Fashion Week. Activists carried coffins and waved flags, while musicians led them towards the event's main venue. Funeral attire, dead flowers and sustainable fashion designs were paraded through London. Earlier, activists poured out a bleeding red carpet on the opening day of London Fashion Week. They also demonstrated outside Victoria Beckham's fashion show over the weekend. Extinction Rebellion had called on London Fashion Week's organisers to cancel the event, which was going to last 5 days. And with growing environmental awareness, demonstrators call for fashion brands to go green. Bingo halls are shutting across the United Kingdom and numbers are dwindling. But Glasgow's enduring love of the fast-paced numbers game is bucking the trend. Let's take a look.
Most nights of the week, Margaret Fisher can be found at the same Glasgow Bingo Club. She has been frequenting it for nearly 25 years.
Well, I like the atmosphere in it. I like the adrenaline rush when you're playing bingo and you meet friends, have a good time, a good laugh. So get shouting about.
Historically beloved by British grandmothers, the game sees players win payouts if they match sets of numbers between 1 and 90 announced by a caller. Unlike other gambling games, it tends to attract more women than men, according to the Bingo Association.
It started off as something I used to do with my mum, so it kind of was passed through generations. So my mum went with my gran, and then as soon as I was old enough, my mum was like, "You're coming to the bingo," and I've just been hooked on it ever since.
Bingo had its heyday in Britain in 1960s, but its popularity continues in some places, none more so than in Glasgow. At least 14 clubs remain across Scotland's biggest city and its suburbs, more than anywhere else in Britain. But the number was at least twice that in 1980s.
As you go to other cities, like Edinburgh for say, what happened in Edinburgh is that the local population moved out of the city, so bingo is not as popular in Edinburgh as it once was, because it's been pushed to suburbs. Well, in Glasgow, we've still got these big housing conurbations at the east end of Glasgow, so we get these massive bingo clubs like you have here in the Glasgow Fords.
Across town, at a trendy converted industrial space on the banks of River Clyde, a new version of the game has abandoned all usual etiquettes. Bongo's Bingo, played in nightclub-style setting and livened by music, is attracting the Friday night party crowd.
First up in business, South Korea has dropped Japan from its list of countries with preferential trade status. Japan has already downgraded South Korea's status as part of an escalating diplomatic and trade row between the two neighbors. South Korea's Ministry of Trade and Energy says the regulations will apply to weapons exports. Relations between the two countries have declined after a ruling by South Korea's Supreme Court last year. The ruling says Japanese companies should compensate South Koreans used as forced labor during World War II. European stock markets have moved marginally higher as investors await a US Federal Reserve decision on interest rates later today. Markets are also watching developments in the Gulf after last weekend's airstrikes on Saudi oil installations. The FTSE 100 index is leading gains in Europe after Asian bourses closed mixed. Tokyo's Nikkei 225 index was fractionally lower, snapping a 10-day streak of gains. Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index was in a negative territory for the third consecutive day. The Shanghai Composite regained 0.25% after yesterday's losses. Well, a huge waterspout appeared in southwest China's Guangxi Zhuang Autonomous Region. It lasted around 10 minutes at Silver Beach in the city of Beihai. The waterspout wandered the beach, throwing up dust, stones and debris. It later became a colossal water column connecting the sea and the sky. The rare phenomenon is caused when a tornado passes over a lake or the sea and picks up a column of water and mist. It is also called a water dragon. And the weather in Lahore is currently 35 degrees Celsius, but let's take a look what it is around the world. And that was all I have from the news bulletin at the moment, but do stay tuned to Indus News for further updates. And as always, thanks for watching.